Good evening, everyone. It's Tuesday night. We do this every Tuesday night. This is Sharia Crime Stoppers. We bring you webinars of topics of interest. We focus on the enemies within the United States for the most part, things that affect Sharia crime and individual safety as well as the sovereignty of our country. We've had a sub-series called The Enemies Within the Church, and we're continuing that tonight. Just a reminder, you might have seen our previous webinars. We had Trevor Loudon give us an overview of the enemies within the church. We've had Liz Yore and Leo Holman and Janet Levy bring us webinars related to the Catholic Church, the evangelicals, and the Jewish faith. And tonight we're going to continue. We're back to having Liz join us, Liz Yore, the enemies within the church. The church we're talking about tonight is the Roman Catholic Church and how it affects all of us, whether we're Catholics or not, related to being citizens of the United States. So we've got Liz Yore, as you may know, as child abuse attorney. We also have Cliff Kincaid with us and Michael Hichborn. We're going to turn it right over to Liz, and she's going to get us started. Do remember that you can ask questions as we go. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just enter your questions. Our good friend and co-founder of Sharia Crime Stoppers, Mary, is in the question monitoring room, and will come on as necessary to bring your questions forward. So this should be quite interesting, whether you're a Catholic or not. This is very important because we're all Americans, and there's an impact of it on this, on the whole country. So Liz, you are welcome. Happy to have you here.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you, and most delighted to be with my prominent and eminent investigative journalists, researchers, fellow Catholics tonight. And these two men have really distinguished themselves as, I would say, the foremost investigative journalists in the field of the Catholic Church. And their work has been really groundbreaking. And personally, I thought both of them in their own particular field should have won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism a long time ago. But I'm happy to first introduce to you, in the blue shirt, Michael Hichborn. Michael is the president of the Lepanto Institute. He's an author, very well-renowned author, much sought-after speaker. Michael formerly worked at the American Life League as their director of the Defend the Faith project. And he has researched and produced all sorts of articles on the funding of the Campaign for Human Development, which we'll talk about tonight. But also, when he was at the American Life League, he researched on the issues of abortion, birth control, homosexuality, Marxism in the church, all within the umbrella of various Catholic organizations such as Catholic Relief Services and, as I mentioned, the Campaign for Human Development. He is one that has really, I think he set the standard for closing your wallets, and we're going to talk about his campaign based on the research that he did over the last few years. Michael holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Christendom College in Political Science and Economics and a Master's degree in Education from American Intercontinental University. Michael lives in Virginia with his wife Alyssa and their 5 children. Michael, welcome. And next up is Cliff Kincaid, who I've known for many years. Cliff is an author of 10, 20, 30 books, I don't know. Cliff is always sending me a copy of his books, and they're always page turners. So he'll talk about his books today, but he is also an investigative journalist. He's a conservative political activist as well. He's the director of the Center for Investigative Journalism of the watchdog organization Accuracy in Media, which claims much of the American media, as we all know on this call, is biased toward liberal candidates and policy positions. Cliff has written publications for Human Events, which is a former weekly newspaper, and that's now become a website. Cliff has graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Communications from the University of Toledo in Ohio. And at his college newspaper, he won an award, this doesn't surprise me, for editorial writing from the Society for Professional Journalists. I'm sure, Cliff, that those professional journalists wouldn't share your political views nowadays. But you can see all of Cliff's amazing investigative work on his YouTube channel, USA Survival. So first I want to turn to Michael tonight. Michael, you have done just extraordinary work in investigating, shall we say, show me the money. Where did the money go for the Campaign for Human Development, a hugely successful campaign run by the USCCB? I think our audience would be very interested to know how it started, who were the founders of the Campaign for Human Development, and really what got you looking into what organizations are they funding and where did the money go? So, Michael, you've got the floor.
Sure. So I'm going to start with your last question first. The way that I got into the Catholic Campaign for Human Development investigations is kind of funny. I was working for American Life League at the time. I'd been putting together videos for ALL and just generally trying to explain what the kinds of problems we were finding in the pro-life movement were. And a friend of mine contacted me and said, you might want to take a look at this. I found some stuff about the CCHD where they're giving money to these groups that are pushing abortion. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. So I put together a little report on it. And after some collaboration back and forth, because he had done the initial research and then I was putting together the report, it wound up kind of blossoming into a coalition that we developed to say to the Catholic Church, hey, as Catholics who are fundamentally pro-life, we don't want our money going to organizations and agencies that are fighting against the Catholic Church. I mean, why would you fund your enemies, right?
Right.
So, you know, this actually led to a lot of discussion with the individuals who work at the CCHD because the bishops, a lot of bishops were very upset. They started putting out various letters and saying, hey, we're going to suspend the CCHD collection until this is solved, which forced the hand of the bureaucrats at the USCCB to actually do something. So in terms of just looking at the surface of it, now I was naive at the time. I didn't really know just how deep this problem was. It took me a long time to figure out, well, how did we get to the point where the Catholic Church is kind of turning a blind eye to funding organizations like this? And I started looking, you know, I was getting all kinds of pushback and all kinds of excuses from people saying, oh, it's okay for us to fund this organization. We're not funding that element of it. Well, I mean, come on, everybody knows money is fungible. But so I started looking into the background. And there are several people that have done yeoman's work in exposing kind of the history of the CCHD. Stephanie Block, who wrote a newsletter back in the 90s, and she worked with Paul Acutis in exposing a lot of these guys back in the 80s and 90s. And they talked about who these groups were and where they came from and how the CCHD came to be. And I started looking into it. You know, I was late in the game. But after I started looking into it, I started trying to think, well, this isn't something that just came up out of a vacuum. You know, CCHD, it's the brainchild of a guy named Monsignor Jack Egan. He was close personal friends with Saul Alinsky, and I'm sure that everybody here on the panel and everybody listening at home knows who Saul Alinsky is. You know, you start putting these pieces together and you say, okay, so Saul Alinsky, he's a socialist. Jack Egan, he's a Monsignor. Maybe he was a stooge, just a personal friend, or maybe he was actually part of the whole problem, actually believing in socialism. But they got together and they convinced their archbishop in Chicago to take up a collection to fund Saul Alinsky's community organizing groups. But I didn't stop there because I thought, okay, if you have...
And archbishop was?
Oh, well, at the time it was Roche. It was Bernardin, who was the auxiliary bishop that brought it to the USCCB and pitched it as a big idea. But as I was looking through a lot of this stuff, I still couldn't quite get my head around why did this happen. I mean, if Bernardin, okay, he's a bad actor, Egan, he's a bad actor, but you can't turn around and say every single bishop in the country was just blindsided by this, that they had no idea that their money was going to fund hard left activism. And I started looking in, and I thought, you know, there's got to be some other element to this. And what I found is that it all comes back to early socialism in the Soviet Union, where they were pushing something called front groups. And a front group is an organization that puts up a front. It says, okay, we're just a printing house, and all we're doing is selling books. And we're not communists or anything, but all their books promote certain ideas that lead to communist ideas. So they don't want to say we're communist, and they're not going to sell communist literature, but they'll sell literature that leads to that idea. So this idea of front groups kind of percolated in the background as I was looking into this. And I did an article back in 2015, and the title of the article, it's actually more of a booklet, is The Marxist Core of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Mm-hmm. And I wind up citing all sorts of Marxist sources who talked about the development of these front groups, how they intended to infiltrate the churches to spread immorality, to spread socialist ideas, how they wanted to create a social justice gospel. And when you take all of that and you follow the history of the CCHD and you look at the nonsense that they're spewing now, it is absolutely the end result of those front groups that were established in the 1920s.
And Michael, I have a couple questions. Was this a concerted effort by the bishops? Were they aware of what was going on? Was this just subterfuge? The money came in, and those that were operatives, the socialist operatives, took it and ran with it. What did your research find with respect to the culpability of both the USCCB, which is the Bishops' Conference, for people who don't know, as well as the individual bishops? And who was kind of the point person in getting this money out and pushing it into the leftist anti-Catholic organizations?
So there are many levels to this question. On the very highest level, you have absolute infiltrators, individuals who are in bed with Freemasonry and Marxism and all that kind of stuff, like Cardinal Bernardin. You had Cardinal Roach, you had Dearden, and you had all these other guys who were absolutely there not to promote and to push Catholic thought and Catholic teaching and the idea of salvation, but to push a hard left agenda.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have the hard left infiltrators. But then what you had with the establishment of the CCHD, it got started in Chicago. It took up a collection. It brought in a ton of money because the marketing for it was very strong. You had LBJ's war on poverty, and everybody wanted to help the poor. And then you had all of these ad campaigns for social this and social that. And so everybody was kind of feeling the flavor of helping the poor and aid and development and all that stuff. Well, the USCCB, back then it was the NCCB, kind of rode that wave and said, hey, we can actually get a piece of the pie here. And so they took that collection, they made it national. And the national collection took in all this money. And, you know, with the hard leftists, you know what they wanted to do with it. But with the average bishop, they saw the collection, they saw it as an opportunity to help the poor, and I think most of the bishops in this country at that time simply thought this was another program intended to help the poor. They didn't really read the fine print where it said, none of this is going to go to direct services, none of this is actually going to help individual poor people, all of this is going towards fighting the root causes of poverty, which means political agitation. It was all political agitation. So when you start looking at the bishops that kind of went along with it, when Catholics started complaining in the early 80s, the CCHD, back then it was just the Campaign for Human Development, had to do all kinds of damage control in order to keep the rest of the bishops on board.
Oh.
But then, because it was being run by the bureaucracy of the USCCB, individual bishops no longer had any control or any power to fire anybody at the USCCB unless they were on the committee. They had nothing to do with the actual mechanical governance of the CCHD. When I first met with bishops about the information that I was finding, and I met with quite a few, one of the very first ones I met with, I had a binder of about 400 pages of documentation, and I'm flipping page after page after page, and his jaw just gets lower to the ground, and he goes, "Michael, this is awful. What should we do?" And I was just, "Your Excellency, I'm actually coming to you for help because I don't know what to do. You're the bishop, not me." But he had no idea what could be done in order to change things because, you know, they don't run the bureaucracy. They don't run the things at the USCCB.
At its height, what kind of cash cow are we talking about? How much money?
At its height, I think the most that the CCHD ever distributed was $20 million. But on average, from year to year, it can bounce from as low as 8 or 9 million to as much as about 15 million. So it depends.
And since you've been investigating them and got lots of coverage and really getting the word out, have you seen them pull back, clean up their program, do audits, or what's going on today?
Boy, if we could only get the USCCB to undergo an audit, that would be
I know.
Day. No, there's no audit. But in 2010, after uncovering all sorts of shenanigans at the CCHD, we forced the USCCB to undergo what they called a review and renewal of the CCHD. It was nothing more than, you know, shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic. Yeah. But they wanted to give the appearance that they were doing something so that they could go back to the bishops and say, "See, we fixed the problem. Oh, there was no problem to begin with, but we fixed one if there was one." But they did incorporate the one positive thing that came out of this whole mess was that the CCHD adopted a new guideline which said grantees are not allowed to be members of coalitions. Oh. Now, I think that this is probably one of the biggest topics for this evening because it's through these coalitions that most of these problems are arising. We're finding that through these leftist networks and through these leftist organizations, you'll have one small CCHD grantee, and they may be like a $75,000 a year organization. They're nothing. They have no influence. They have no power, but they become a part of these other coalitions or networks. And those coalitions and networks take all of these different ideologies and they say, we're going to have a march over here. And all of you labor people, you pro-abortion people, you LGBTQ XYZ people, we need all of you to participate in our march. And it's a march because some kid got hit at a bus stop and we need to have a bus sign there. Yeah. But what they're doing, these coalitions take all of these groups, and they say, we're marching under one banner. We are all united. We have a united front. We're all together. So the USCCB put in a guideline that says, if your coalition promotes anything that is contrary to church teaching, you're either going to have to leave the coalition or you're not going to get any funding. Now, they ignore that guideline. They don't care. They just want to be able to point to it and say, we have a rule that says you can't do that. But at the end of the day, we use that now to say, this group is in violation, this group is in violation, this group is in violation. And we point to the bishops and we say, Your Excellencies, you have these rules in place. Why is your bureaucracy not applying the rules to this group and this group and this group? And some of them actually respond and most of them ignore it. But
well, you're being humble. You've been enormously successful in getting the word out. And you've also taught all of us a lesson of really going to where the funding is for these corrupt socialistic organizations within the umbrella of the Catholic Church and learning to turn off the spigot, close your wallet, is, I think, speaks more volume than we have any idea. And we're going to come back to what you're doing in the Catholic Relief Services and international work, because you've used this model. And this is what I would encourage the listeners and the audience tonight. Use that model of, just down and dirty research. Whether it's your parish, whether it's your archdiocese, begin to ask questions, to look at balance sheets, to really start digging, because one of the things, not only about closing your wallet, but we're about empowering Catholics to give them, number one, a voice, to use their skills, their God-given talents, to take back the church, and one of the gentlemen Cliff Kincaid, who's our next speaker, certainly you and Michael are on these parallel tracks of exposing the Marxism influence in the church that's gone way back. And I don't know anybody who has a better view of the church from 30,000 feet up, as well as looking at it from its very beginning in the United States and the infiltration of the leftists, the Marxists, the communists, the Freemasons. So, Cliff, you've done so many research projects. You've got the floor. I'd love you to comment on Michael's work and how it intersects with what you've uncovered. And what are the things that, as Catholics in the pew, because all of us are faithful Catholics despite uncovering some very dark things in the church. We want to encourage people that our role is not only to practice our faith, but to keep our faith, keep it holy, sacred, and absolutely in touch with what has been handed down to us through the Catechism. So, Cliff, you've got the floor.
Liz, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. I worked for Accuracy in Media for many years, but I started over 20 years ago my group, America's Survival Inc. We have several websites that are actually undergoing maintenance, and we're going to be revitalizing those and bringing those back shortly. We're running through some difficulties at the current time, but stay with us, come back. We're going to be back in a big way. As you say, Liz, our YouTube channel is still up and running. But we've decided when we revitalize our efforts to focus a lot on the church problem. You might even call this Vatican Gate. We're involved in a scandal of immense proportions to the point where I don't even know if closing our wallets is going to do the trick, because let's face it, when you look at the financial statements, as I've done, of the U.S. Catholic bishops, you'll find that they get a heck of a lot more money from the federal government, tens of millions of dollars for refugee resettlement. And then we see that just recently, as we discussed before the show, Liz, the Pope Francis, given, I think it was $500,000 for the migrant caravan, so-called, in Mexico. Here in my area, I'm in Maryland, just outside of D.C., over half of the parishioners in the Catholic Church are Latinos. And this has become the new base of the Catholic Church in America. And this is why they want to encourage the illegal alien invasion of the country, because not only are these people being groomed to vote Democrat, and Trevor Loudon has several speeches on that topic, but they're being groomed to be Catholics. Because a lot of people, traditional Americans, shall I say, are leaving the church. My wife and I, we haven't left the church. We don't give any money on Sunday. But we may get to that point, because I do not believe what's existing now worldwide and in the United States is the true church. I would only add, this is an interesting aside, you probably all know that 6 of the 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court were raised as Catholics. 6 of 9. And some of the most notorious decisions handed down by the Supreme Court, such as decisions legalizing gay marriage, were handed down by Catholics. There's one Catholic who was raised Catholic on the court who left the church. And you know who that was?
Yes. He returned to the church.
No, he didn't.
Oh, then I'm thinking about somebody else.
There's 2 people.
Neil Gorsuch.
Oh.
And interestingly enough, it just so happens the timing of this is significant. Over the weekend, I attended a wedding of some good friends at a very historic Catholic church in Maryland. And by the way, isn't it interesting? Maryland is one of the most Catholic states in the country. And like Massachusetts, it's one of the most liberal and left-wing. But at this church, I had a chance at the reception to talk to the priest, and he had been a professor at Georgetown Prep. And Georgetown Prep was basically a Jesuit-run high school, which was attended by Brett Kavanaugh, interestingly enough. Now, I'm not going to go into our efforts to expose Brett Kavanaugh and his background and why he wasn't the right man for the Supreme Court, but this professor told me that one of his students at Georgetown Prep was Neil Gorsuch.
Well,
and I said, because Gorsuch was raised a Catholic. And I said, do you know why Gorsuch left the church? And he says, well, I don't know. He said Gorsuch was very conservative in high school at Georgetown Prep, but he doesn't know why Gorsuch left the church. I think it'd be an interesting topic to raise with him. I don't think he'd talk about it, but we're really on the cusp of an avalanche of people not only withholding money from the church, but leaving the church because the scandals seem to be so big. And just closing our wallets, as great as that may be, is not going to reform this problem. I give Michael Hichborn a lot of credit for his work on the CCHD, Catholic Campaign for Human Development, because when you think about it, how can this, quote, social justice arm of the bishops be funding homosexuality, abortion, and Marxism? I mean, that's illegal, really. The church is supposed to be a tax-exempt, nonprofit, charitable organization. How can they be doing this? How can they be funding these political causes? Now, I should mention, in our work at American Survival over the years, we published 3 books on Barack Hussein Obama, and Michael contributed to one of them. This was one of our books on Obama. It's still available through Amazon.com. Michael wrote the chapter on Obama titled The Catholic Candidate. People have to remember that Obama was the Catholic candidate. He was supported by most Catholics in the election, 2008. He got his start with the support of the Catholic Church in Chicago. As Michael alluded to, because Chicago was the home for Saul Alinsky and the Industrial Areas Foundation and other groups, they were all supported by the Catholic Church. And Obama openly credited them and gave them thanks for helping him get his start in politics. And they not only supported him on the local or state level, but on a national level and even global level. And that's where we get into some other areas, like Michael Hichborn has written about it as well. He has a great report on something called the World Social Forum, which is another one of these front groups, this one on a global level, that the Catholic Church under Pope Francis is very deeply involved in. So we've got a big problem that's facing us right in front of our eyes. And if people are thinking, oh, Kincaid, he's off his rocker, he's on the fringe, I would only mention, and this is one of several I could cite, this is an article that was written in New Politics. This is a socialist review written by a Marxist scholar named Richard Grieman, and it's called Catholicism, the New Communism. And what he recognizes is, I think, what we recognize, that the Catholic Church globally has become a major force for international communism, albeit with a religious veneer. And when we look at where the money's going, I would just cite, before we go on and get into some discussion and questions, that there have been several good books written. This is one that I would highly recommend to people, The Dictator Pope. And he has a section in there on this Peter's Pence. And we should remind people, this is a new collection that's going to be coming up in the Catholic churches soon, where people are told that, well, just contribute. This is going to a special fund under the direction of the Pope, and he's going to help all these people in need around the world. And of course, as we mentioned, 500,000's already gone to support the invasion of our southern border. But in this book, The Dictator Pope, there's a reference to Peter's Pence, this collection, being used to actually support in 2016 the Hillary Clinton for President campaign. Here's what he writes. In 2016, Pope Francis staked all his chips on a Clinton presidency. Those around him, beginning with Cardinal Parolin, told him that Donald Trump had no hope of winning. And on Francis's orders, the administration of the Patrimony of the Apostolic See helped finance Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. He adds in parentheses, it's now being said that the money used for it came from Peter's Pence, the donations of the faithful made supposedly for charitable purposes. So once again, we have some circumstantial evidence here that things have gotten overtly political. This is really illegal. This is not only using this money for political purposes, partisan purposes, but then the vast amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars that have reportedly gone to settle many of the sex abuse cases. And just in conclusion, let me say that I agree, stop the money, don't send any more money, but we have to go beyond that. We have to, I think, encourage some of the governmental authorities, such as in West Virginia, where they have a new scandal there. The state attorney general has sued the Catholic Church. We have various grand juries being convened, various lawsuits ongoing. And Liz, you were one of the signers of a great letter to President Trump, asking him to take a look at the hard evidence that Pope Francis worked hand in glove with the George Soros movement on behalf of Hillary. We need an investigation of that. We can't constantly be behind the curve on this and trying to play catch up. We have to take the offensive. There's no reason why we shouldn't be investigating all of this on the national and global levels with the machinery of government. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree. Yes, Dick. Yes.
I just want to chime in. I think this is very, very, very important. You mentioned that Obama was the Catholic candidate. I think you said in 2008. We just talked about the Catholic candidate Hillary. We probably could talk a little bit about, before Hillary, Bernie Sanders was certainly involved in direct communication with Vatican organizations. I think we should go into that when we have time.
Yes.
What I'd like to project, though, is the 2020 Catholic candidate. I guess my comment is everyone in this audience should begin to think about what action of the kind we're discussing will the Catholic Church certainly will not be behind Donald Trump. That's pretty obvious policy-wise. And so we should begin to think about what could happen if we don't have indictments now, this year, if we are not talking about collusion of elections in America from foreign organizations, and in this case, the Vatican. I think shedding light on that is critically important, because otherwise we should expect massive inflow of influence, money, etc., and influence directly push down the hierarchy to the pastor, to the priest, to the people in the pews related to Donald Trump, yes or no. It is that profound. And what we want to try to do is walk away from all of these webinars with the notion that people have in their hands the ability to be registered to vote, the ability to work, get their neighbor, get their parishioners registered to vote, and to think carefully about who is influencing these elections. We're all concerned about collusion. I think we're just touched on collusion that I think we'll probably get back to. But Bernie Sanders apparently was under.
Bernie Sanders was there at the Vatican, met the Pope, spoke at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, which is an organization within the dicastery in the Vatican. He was given quite a wonderful welcome. He was brought in by one of his experts in the economic experts, Jeffrey Sachs, who introduced him all around the Vatican. He was the socialist choice of this, what I believe is the socialist Pope. But there are all sorts of pictures of Bernie in the Vatican. Interestingly, your audience may recall that in the WikiLeaks disclosure, that there was all sorts of information regarding John Podesta with his emails and his communication with the Vatican and these organizations that Michael and Cliff have talked about, these coalitions, climate change coalitions, and they were sent over to the Vatican at the invitation of the Vatican to coordinate with the Vatican the campaign talking points of Hillary Clinton, along with the pronouncements from the Vatican. The audience may recall, we all have short memories. Payne has a short memory. The Pope, in one of his airplane conferences, mentioned that, talked about the wall, Canada, Trump, and said, it was unchristian, in his opinion, to talk about a wall, to promote a wall. And so that was his weighing in on the 2016 election. And there were some other comments as well, which was really quite unheard of. Didn't say anything about Hillary Clinton's position on abortion and the Democratic Party's position on abortion. Now we'll be able to talk about the Democratic Party's position on infanticide. But there was, and I'm sure we haven't even scratched the surface, there was a huge coordinated effort with the Francis papacy and the Democratic Party here in the United States. They desperately wanted Hillary Clinton to win. And my argument, that's why we sent the letter to President Trump. My argument is that they had to get rid of Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict was very, very strong in support of re-Christianizing Europe. He had, in the very early part of his papacy, he had given a speech in Regensburg that was viewed as an anti-Islamic speech. But in fact, he understood, because he had studied Islam. So he would have also been against the Islamic invasion that occurred in 2015. Whereas we know Pope Francis has been welcoming the Muslim invasion into Europe. Pope Francis does not discuss the violence in Europe by Islam and radical jihad. In fact, his famous comment, if I have to talk about Islamic violence, I must talk about Catholic violence, which was absolutely absurd and infuriating. So the audience should know that once Benedict was gone, and Benedict was and is so smart about issues, complex issues, that he brings in both sides of the argument, because he's smart enough to listen and ask questions and to pierce, the fallacy of certain arguments. For example, when he had a climate change conference, he brought in both sides to discuss, whereas Francis had none. He was only interested in the pro-climate change agenda and pushing the UN agenda. Pope Francis was promoting Bolivia, Evo Morales, the communist Marxist president. He promoted the Iran deal. for Barack Obama. He provided back channels, diplomatic channels for the Cuba deal. And, you know, the Cuba deal was so secret and was so controversial, especially for the Cubans in Miami. And because there had been no real change, no real democracy in Cuba. It was so secret. Barack Obama used the Cardinal in Cuba and used Ted McCarrick and Pope Francis to get that deal done. So there were all sorts of reasons as far as Barack Obama and the Democratic Party was to get rid of Pope Benedict. Wow. The Pope Benedict, in my estimation, was an obstacle, a wall, if you will, to the second term agenda of Barack Obama. Once he was pushed out of the way, wow. Barack Obama was able to succeed in the Paris Climate Treaty, the Iran deal, the Cuba deal, the migration into Europe, the Soros deal, and he was able to do that with his partner, Pope Francis. And so this is the pattern that is very, very disturbing. There's another book, you know, The Dictator Pope is a great book, The Political Pope. And I think that's really basically what we're talking about. The Political Pope by George Neumeyer is about how this Pope has infiltrated and put himself right in the middle of the political agenda. We see that now in Europe with Salvini, Deputy right. Prime Minister Salvini, who pulls up his in the air and says, I dedicate and consecrate my country and my people to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Yet Pope Francis won't meet with this man who is a Catholic and who's very pro-life. But Pope Francis will meet with Italy's, I call her Italy's Gosnell, Emma Bonino, who was an abortionist herself. And Francis incredibly called her one of Italy's greats. So this is the battle that all of us are really dealing with, is trying to take back our church in the United States, to stem the infiltration of our leftist pope, the leftist bishops, in interfering in the election. Because clearly, you know, and this is not just me talking, there's, I think, a consensus that Donald Trump is the most pro-life president we've ever had. And let's keep our fingers crossed that that continues. But going back to Peter's Pence and my first time meeting Pope Francis, I attended a human trafficking conference at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. I want to share this experience with you. This was in November of 2013. Francis had only been Pope for 6 months. And I was excited because he was talking about human trafficking, which was my issue. So I went over to this conference. There were 80 international, quote unquote, human trafficking experts. And I thought I was in the midst of a radical Barack Obama Justice Department meeting. And I knew one other person from the States who was there, and he turned to me and said, are we the only pro-lifers here, Liz? Wow. And are we in the Vatican and there are no pro-lifers at this meeting? And so at the meeting, I have to say my soul was rattled. I could not make what is going on, this radical agenda. Frankly, they weren't even talking about human trafficking. They were talking about social justice issues. And so I met the Pope, and I was waiting for that, you know, leap of excitement and that soul-to-soul connection, which I didn't get. But I left that meeting determined, like Michael and Cliff, determined to investigate what was going on in the Vatican and under this papacy. And, you know, specifically at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, which is where Bernie Sanders went, Soros people, Jeff Sachs and others. But to the point of the Peters Pence collection. The Pope gave $500,000 to support the caravan coming over the border. As a human trafficking person who's fought, valiantly and hard to help and rescue victims, here he's giving money to a place that is fostering human trafficking. And he is very quick to say that, this is one of his number one issues, that he cares about it greatly. But to me, it was a direct contradiction. In fact, in my mind, it was nothing short of exactly what's going on in Europe, is this infiltration of the disruption of Western civilization, Catholicism, and Christianity. And we know the same thing is happening on our southern border. As we now hear, coming across the border are people from Nigeria, from Africa, MS-13. They're coming in from China. ISIS, there are indications that ISIS is planning people coming over the border. So this is the issue, as far as I'm concerned, is the money funded by the Vatican supporting the destruction of our country and fostering not Christianity, not helping the poor, but fostering the destabilization of our civilization. And, that is actually the exciting thing that's happening over in Europe. That these populist, the Catholic imagination is coming out not in the church, but in politics. It's really an interesting phenomenon with Salvini and Le Pen and Orban and others, that the Catholic politicians are saying, I am going to, in conjunction with my faith, I'm going to restore my culture in the country, the culture of the country, the culture of the Catholic faith that formed, these great countries over there, and to bring people back to the faith. And I think that's the very issue that we're trying to do here with our, as you investigate these issues, it's tough going. It's tough going not only to, correct me if I'm wrong, not only as Catholics to stay grounded in the faith, not to let your fury take over and to just throw your hands up and say, what? I can't believe they're doing this. But there's something happening around the world. There's this reasserting of the Catholic faith that created the culture, Western civilization in Europe and around the world. And it's a battle. It's going to be the ultimate struggle of civilization. Yet again, we know Michael and Lepanto, that thanks to our Blessed Mother and the Rosary and a Pope who said to Europe, get down on your knees and say the Rosary, that's why the Christians won the battle against overwhelming odds against the Muslim invaders in 1500 or so, right? Michael, you would know. But, so I think that's, and I think that's why these webinars are so important, is because we discuss the political issues, the enemy within our church, but we always fall back on the importance of using our faith, the experience of the Holy Spirit, shining the light on these dark corners. And I'm a believer that this is really an exciting time. I mean, I'm now finding out for the first time what's been going on in the church. And I've been involved in clergy abuse cases going way back when, but to the extent that the light is being shined on these things, for example, the $300 million that the bishop spent last year on clergy abuse settlements. It's interesting. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. They've been, the bishops are saying, oh, clergy abuse, it's all over, the scandal's all over, that's all behind us. And now we have these, uptick in allegations again. And $300 million, some of it is insurance, but some of it is selling properties, properties that were built with the hands and sweat of immigrants, Catholic immigrants who came to this country. So, this to me is an exciting time to be living as Catholics. But I also think that we have to think outside the box, like these two gentlemen, about how to expose what hasn't been exposed for the last 50, 60 years in this country. Michael, maybe you can share what you've learned with Cardinal Mary Diaga, the Catholic Relief Services, Caritas, all those international organizations, and how people need to realize that they have the ability to speak out, to speak up, and to close their wallets.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had brought up several points that I was thinking of as you were talking. You talked about Caritas Internationalis. You talked about the World Social Forum. You brought up Ted McCarrick. And it's interesting that you mentioned that he was one of the moving forces between Obama and Pope Francis in making that Cuba deal happen. But it wasn't just that. It was also China. Yeah. Okay. Ted McCarrick, if you read the Figueredo testimony, there's all kinds of communications where McCarrick was telling Pope Francis, okay, I'm going to be going to China and I'm going to be working this deal. I'm going to continue to work this deal. What was the end result? The end result was that the Communist Patriotic Church wound up being the ones who had all the power, and the underground, authentic, faithful Catholics are now being horribly, horribly persecuted, and they're using this deal as leverage for butchering these people. Yeah. They are butchering our faithful brethren. And it's all happening under Pope Francis's watch. Now, you also mentioned going to the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences. And you and I have spoken at length about our good friend, Jeffrey Sachs.
Yes.
Now, I did an article back in 2015, and the title is Marxists in the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. And I profiled about half a dozen different members of the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences, including Margaret Archer, who is or has been, I don't think that she is anymore, but up until recently had been the president of the PASS. And she's a flaming Marxist. I read her books. It's all critical theory, this, and critical realism, that. It's all Marxism.
Yeah.
And you start looking at, well, okay, why would somebody who's a Marxist, a flaming Marxist, be in charge of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences? What are they pushing? What's their agenda? So you start looking at the things that they're doing. You look at their conferences and who they're inviting over and what they're talking about. And the number one central theme, bar none, is the social development goals of the United Nations. Now, the social development goals of the United Nations, for those who don't know, I did an article also. The question was, why is the Vatican pushing communist goals? These line up with the planks of communism point for point. They are all communist goals. And if you want to understand what sustainable development is all about, just focus on the word sustainability. Because sustainability says not beyond parameters. Okay, that's the definition of sustainability. You want to make sure that it's not beyond the parameters. What are we talking about? We're talking about family growth. We're talking about development. In other words, the developing world. You don't want to have too many people. Couldn't have that. Which is why one of the big things they're pushing is family planning, safe legal abortion, and they're also very big on equality and non-discrimination, which includes but not specifies the homosexual stuff too. Why? Because that fits in with their population control agenda. So the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences is very strongly pushing the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, the Vatican and Pope Francis and Cardinal Turkson just had a huge meeting in Rome, and I think this took place in March. And at this meeting, the topic was using religion as a means of pushing the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so you have this theme now where they want to use the Catholic Church to create this socialist utopia under the auspices of the United Nations. At the same time, you've got organizations like Caritas Internationalis and the CIDSE, which is a conglomeration of various international aid and development groups that are Catholic. And what are they doing? They're going to the World Social Forum, which is getting the people involved and trying to create a groundswell of support for these radical Marxist ideologies. And they're using this neoliberal dialectic where they're saying, well, we don't want to be a part of this corporatist international corporation, but we want to have our own groundswell of democratic societies where we all get together. Well, who's going to run this? Well, who do you think's going to run it? It's going to require a supranational organization or entity, as Pope Francis recently pointed out. And that supranational entity is the United Nations. I have a document that was published in 2006. It was published, it was a joint publication between CIDSE and Caritas Internationalis. And the topic, or the title of it was Towards Global Governance Through a Catholic Lens. And the whole idea was that we want to create global governance, not global government, but global governance. Okay, there's no difference. It's a distinction without a difference. So all of this comes together in these groups. They are a globalist entity, a globalist society that is built on the idea of the civilization of man as opposed to the civilization of God. And Pope Francis is trying to get Catholics rallied on board for this international supranational entity. This is why he's so big on environmentalism. When I was growing up, my grandfather always referred to environmentalists as watermelon socialists. And I said, well, what does that mean? He says, well, they're green on the outside, but they're red in the middle. So, you know, so this idea of using the environment as a cohesive entity, it's supposed to be kind of the glue that brings it all together. Oh, we have this this global threat that we all have to rally around to fight. You know, you see Independence Day, the movie from the 90s, where the aliens get together, and what happens? All the nations join together in order to fight this one horrible, evil thing. Well, what's the evil monster at the end of our day? It's global climate change, obviously, and we have to get together and fight it. So it's being used as a vehicle to push the socialist idea. In this push, in the use of environmentalism, what are we hearing? We're hearing that environmentalism affects the poor. Why? Because the global climate change is causing local indigenous peoples to lose their resources so that they can have sustainability in their own communities. And you're hearing the rhetoric that it's also causing mass migration, which is why we have to open the borders, which is why we have to let people in. So all of this is predicated on environmentalism. That's the glue, the vehicle that's driving this whole machine. And so when you have Pope Francis sending $500,000, and let's face it, there were 17,000 refugees sitting at the border. $500,000 is going to buy everybody a Whopper at Burger King. That's all it's going to do. Okay? So he had something else in mind. For one thing, it was a big publicity stunt to draw attention to the fact that, oh, there are all these poor people at the border and they can't go anywhere and da-da-da-da. Well, so he's trying to drive a narrative. He's trying to change the narrative and change the focus. And what's going to happen? He's going to turn right back to environmentalism and say, this is why we have to have a global entity that helps us to solve these disputes and to solve these matters so that these poor people don't get left in the lurch. And it's all this appeal to the heartstrings. And it's being driven by Radiaga, Turkson, Pope Francis, you know, Cardinal Schönborn and Cardinal Marx. And, you know, you just take a dart and throw it at the list of cardinals today, and you've hit one of them. Cardinal Tagle, who's in charge of the dicastery for justice and peace now at the Vatican, they're all in bed with this. They're all pushing the idea. So the question that you also asked was, well, what about the money? Peter's Pence it's just a collection for Pope Francis's, or for the Pope's own use. In other words, the idea is that Peter would then use that money and reallocate it in order to take care of the poor in various areas. It never really had a whole lot of money to it. It was mostly a local thing. It was never intended to be an international thing. If they're talking about raising this to the level of an international collection, I think that the bigger threat is not that it will be a collection, but a tax. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you have your diocese, the bishop at a local diocese, he taxes his local parishes. They all pay into the bishop's coffers so that the bishop can run the diocese and, you know, ostensibly make sure that everything's run smoothly. But when you have a Supich or when you have a Tobin, you take that money and you start reallocating it for your socialist projects, and you start using it to push your radical agendas. That tax trickles into the USCCB because each diocese pays into the USCCB. So you have kind of a national tax that goes to a singular entity. If Pope Francis were to issue the Peter's Pence tax, which is where I think this is going, I don't think it's going to be a collection, I think it's going to be a tax, then every diocese in the world is going to be paying a portion of what they have into the Vatican. And Pope Francis will then have a mega collection that he can do whatever he wants with. It's his money, his pence. And that's, if he wants to throw $500,000 at a bunch of refugees right now, and he says, well, that wasn't enough, I didn't have enough money to do it, the next step is to say, I need more money, which means all of you need to pay into this so that we can have what we need in order to push this idea.
Cliff, I know you must have some ideas. Thank you, Michael. That was an interesting, fascinating look at what's really going on underneath the surface. Cliff, what are your thoughts?
The money is so interesting because it's difficult in many cases to get a handle on how much the church has, or the bishops or the Pope or the Vatican. I think what Michael said about Peter's Pence being graduated into a tax is definitely a possibility. Now, I've been part of many efforts to get to the bottom of where the money's going, who's contributing. It's very difficult. I'll give you one quick example, and this can be copied or emulated with different results, perhaps, in different parishes. But in one case, I knew several Catholics, members of the parish, who were on the church budget committee. And they were looking at the money, where it was coming, where it was going, and they objected to certain expenditures just by a local priest, and they were forced off the budget committee. Mm-hmm. And there's been some questions about, in light of the revelations from the Dictator Pope book, about what's been happening at the Vatican Bank, and whether any legitimate audits are being taken care of. Now, we may not have any direct influence on any of that, but I'll tell you, one thing I return to that disturbs me is the amount of money going into the Catholic Church in America to resettle these refugees. The Catholic Church is resettling 1/3 of all the refugees coming into the United States. I've already said I think one purpose is to get them going to church, going to Catholic churches, and also voting Democrat. I think it's a two-edged sword. And these documents are publicly available. These are audits of the USCCB. And here's how much in government grants the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops got in 2017, $72 million. $72 million. In 2016, it was $95 million. Now, that's simply extraordinary. And especially when you consider that basically this is another incentive to continue the invasion of the United States.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things we've come across in trying to fight this battle on a local level is we find some parishioners saying to us in regards to the child abuse scandal, well, yeah, there's been some bad priests. There's been some bad actors, but it's just a couple percentage points, no different than the percentage of child molesters in society at large. The problem with the Catholic Church is that they've been at the very top. That's the problem, and that's why we get back to the case of Cardinal McCarrick. Now, I know because I interviewed Matt Abbott and Randy Engel that McCarrick's predator activities were well known for many years, and they just broke into public view, of course, over the last year or so. But McCarrick, of course, the Archbishop of Washington at one point, was a key player. And now we know that Cardinal Wuerl, his successor, knew about McCarrick. Mm-hmm. And now we know, according to Vigano, that Pope Francis knew and covered up. So this goes all the way to the top in terms of knowledge of what McCarrick was up to. But as Michael and Liz have referred to, McCarrick's corruption wasn't just in regard to abusing seminarians and a minor, at least one case that we know has been documented. When Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, my group, I think, was almost alone in raising questions about his, quote, Catholicism. Now, he advertised it on his sleeve. When he was nominated, he talked about his Catholic upbringing. He talked about how he'd gone to various, let me get back on the screen, various Catholic schools. He had been a coach for a Catholic girls basketball team because he had some daughters. But here's what we discovered, that McCarrick had been to Kavanaugh's church. It's called Blessed Sacrament Parish. It's in D.C., right across the border from Maryland. Yeah. And McCarrick, this was back in 2008. This is interesting. This is when Obama was running for his first term. McCarrick was featured at the church talking about peace in the Middle East and how Muslims supposedly worship the same God as Christians and Jews. This is what I wrote at the time in my article about this. McCarrick favorably compared Islam to Catholicism and had actually been labeled McCarrick the Muslim. He visited Iran in 2011 with Nihad Awad, Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, Muslim Brotherhood affiliate. And what we were saying about Kavanaugh was, it's fine to wear your Catholicism on your sleeve, but in light of what we know about corruption in the church, what did you, Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, what did you do at Blessed Sacrament about any of this? Did he ever raise questions about where the money was going, about the reports that were known then, about McCarrick, about the cases of abuse in the church, about the social justice movement that was capturing so many parishes? What did he do? What did he say? Did he protest? Did he do anything other than coach a girls' basketball team at a Catholic school? I mean, what I'm trying to get at, folks, is that the burden is really on us, Catholics especially, in the churches, to start raising these questions directly to other parishioners and to the priests. Mm-hmm. And not only to close our wallets. Yeah, we got to close our wallets, but start raising our hands and saying, what's going on here? Now, fortunately, very quickly in the parish I go to in Southern Maryland, we've had a priest get up in the pulpit and deliver a homily in the wake of all these scandals. and talk openly about a lavender mafia in the Catholic Church. And clearly this priest wouldn't go to this church if he didn't have a conservative bent.
Yeah.
He's been outspoken about it. You know, we know there's others who have suffered at the hands of McCarrick, or in the case of this West Virginia former bishop, suffered at the hands of his predatory activities. We've got to encourage the fine young priests, even those who've been there for many years, to come out. I know it's going to be risky, but to come out and talk openly about the corruption in the church. We've got to get it all out in the open, in my view.
Thank you. Do you have a question, Dick?
Well, I think we're going to move on to some questions. We have some really good questions in a bit, but maybe we can get some final commentary. Just a footnote on a couple things. The Refugee Resettlement Program is a great example of blind, turning the eye, intended blindness. As Cliff mentioned, when you look at the numbers, $3 billion has gone from the federal taxpayer into the pocket of the Conference of Catholic Bishops for moving human beings into America. The Catholic Church, the bishops have to know of those hundreds of thousands of people that they've moved. They did not care, because we know that they've moved a major percentage of the Muslim community into the United States, into the Somaliland and Minnesota, into the Syrian communities, and other groups in Michigan. We know for a fact, we know the numbers, you can look them up. And so to receive money, almost like a human trafficker or a mule, to move a commodity that you don't investigate in terms of its potential toxicity to your own faith, to your own parishioners. When you move people who practice Sharia and do terrible things to little girls, I know female genital mutilation is something that Liz works on. When you are part of that program and you don't ask the questions and you're just dealing with the money, that willful blindness is sinful. And so we just want to make this point. There's all kind of manipulation with money globally, whether it's in Europe or in America, that is massive, and that you can lay to the feet of the cardinals and the Pope in the Catholic Church. There's no way to deny it. And if it's okay, if parishioners think it's okay that a subset of the FGM activity in America, female genital mutilation, you can actually trace back to the Catholic Church moving bodies into America. I mean, that's not a hard conversation if you dig a little bit. So that point alone, I just wanted to comment on.
Well, I think it's really important for your listeners to understand that at the hub of both the communist infiltration, the Islam interfaith dialogue, the radical left agenda, the homosexual agenda in the church, there's one key person who was there for 60 years, that's Ted McCarrick. And in 1998, Ted McCarrick was an envoy for the interfaith dialogue for Bill Clinton. Ted McCarrick got the Eleanor Roosevelt Award from Bill Clinton for his work in promoting, quote unquote, justice and peace among our Muslim brothers. Ted McCarrick was there the week after 9/11 with all of his Muslim friends saying, we need to have a mosque at Ground Zero. Ted McCarrick was the one who was promoting all the Muslim Brotherhood issues, the care issues, going all over the world, promoting them, being the Catholic face. And so it shouldn't be any surprise. It shouldn't be any surprise when Pope Francis, who has been doing much the same thing, signs in Abu Dhabi the Abu Dhabi Declaration stating that all religions are the same. God wills all the religions. And your listeners should know that one of the closest friends, personal friends of Ted McCarrick is Joe Biden. Joe Biden and Ted McCarrick worked hand in hand in Congress, in the Senate, on all these issues. Joe Biden and Pat Leahy and Dick Durbin were the ones who brought Ted McCarrick, the notorious sexual predator, into the Situation Room of the White House. to help in negotiating the Cuba deal, getting on the phone with Pope Francis. That is, and we don't even know half of what McCarrick did, but that is the cross-section of the interfaith dialogue, the bringing in Muslims, the invasion of Muslims into the United States, the radical jihad, and the interfaith dialogue, which is the Catholic faith saying, we are all the same. There's Catholic violence and there's Islamic violence. We're no better, we're no less. That was started by Ted McCarrick on behalf of the USCCB and the Catholic Church, and he traveled millions of miles promoting that lie. And so here we have, and I think it's very interesting that we have all of his Muslim friends, prominent imams, would bring him all over the world. As we mentioned, he brought him into, he was often in China, meeting with his communist friends, his communist patriotic church friends, always staying at the Beijing seminary. I mean, he could have stayed at any parish, but always stayed at the Beijing seminary, the man who was notoriously preying on seminarians. This is the man who's finally been exposed, but as he has been exposed, we're now exposing, the communist agenda, the Marxist agenda, the climate change agenda, the interfaith dialogue agenda, hoax. They're all hoaxes. Climate change is a hoax. And that's what people have to realize. And so I think, as I said, it's good that this is finally coming out.
Well, you guys have set the lines on fire, and Mary is sitting there with a list of questions you cannot believe. So, in due respect, let's give Mary a shot. I think it's time to wrap up. But Mary has a long list.
Yeah, there was only about 3 or 4 there up until about the last 20 minutes. All right, there's a couple of quick ones I think we can answer, and I think these go to Cliff. Is the Lavender Mafia the gay mafia?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me send that one. And most priests and bishops will not counter the Vatican orders coming down from Pope Francis. What should they do?
That's a good question. It's interesting from my perspective to see that the conservatives in the ranks, the conservative priests, are able to resist the U.S. Catholic Conference and the Vatican to some extent. And I'll give you one quick example without naming any names. At one parish that we used to attend in the D.C., Maryland area, we had a very conservative priest. This was during Obama's tenure, where he got up in a homily and spoke out strongly in favor of religious freedom and spoke out against Obamacare. Now remember, overall, the bishops supported Obamacare. Mm-hmm. But this priest took a different tact. He said, if this goes through, I predict that they're going to be controlling people's lives, and that we'll see more government control over our lives generally, and we'll lose our freedom not only in the healthcare field, but our ability eventually to speak out on some of these issues. I was very impressed by the homily. I actually, because I'm a journalist, went back home and wrote it up into a column. This priest later told me that I had gotten him into some trouble because of his outspokenness being put down on the record, and obviously it had gotten read in Washington and perhaps in Rome. And he, 2 years later, was transferred to another parish. Now, remember, in the Catholic Church, the Archbishop of Washington and of any area really can transfer these priests like that. Usually they're transferred in some cases after 7 years. Usually they last 7 years, but in many cases they're allowed to stay. My point is they have to please the hierarchy, and we know that, and they take risks. And it's sad to see some who are outspoken on religious freedom issues, on freedom in general, get punished by the hierarchy. That's a fact of life, though. This one who talked in my current parish about the Lavender Mafia, I was shocked that he was that outspoken. But he talked openly, again, in a congregation. These are not private off-the-record comments. These are openly said. And because he's been in the priesthood many, many years, decades actually, I don't know that he's going to suffer for that, for speaking out, but it was almost as if in his homily he talked about the fact that people knew about McCarrick within the church. The priests knew, the hierarchy knew, and we know, but he openly admitted it. So my point is to get in touch with the local priests. Now, one thing the Catholic Church can't do, they can certainly move the priests around, but they can't move you around. You still have the right, you still have the freedom to go to any church you want to. We've moved around in our area outside Maryland, outside of D.C. and southern Maryland. We move around. And here's the key, in my view. Cut off the money, that's true. Number two, closely follow the homilies of the priest. And if you find that they're avoiding certain subjects, like religious freedom, like Obamacare, like abortion, like homosexuality, like same-sex marriage, if they're avoiding those, then you've probably got one of the social justice priests. You've got one who's in sync with Pope Francis. If you have a priest who's talking about climate change, get out. Move. Go somewhere else. Seriously.
Yeah.
This is one problem I find with people we know who they've gone to one church for so long, and even though the priest change and they get a bad priest, they still go to the same church because that's where they've been going. You know, they sit in the same pew, they go to the same service, same time. Come on, Catholics, wake up. You've got to move. You got to move on. Don't give them the money and then move on. And eventually, like Neil Gorsuch, maybe we're going to move on and move out. But maybe that'll have to be the way we send a message, because I've said before, I think if Christ came back to earth, he would close down this church, just like he threw the money changers out of the temple.
Yep.
We've got a current crop of money changers in the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Cliff, you mentioned Kavanaugh numerous times. Do you know if he was a proponent of the refugee racket, as Brenda asks?
I don't know, but I don't know to the contrary. This is the thing. When he got nominated, he was supposed to be a great Catholic. And then one of the first decisions he makes out of the box just a few months ago was not taking up a case where they could have defunded Planned Parenthood. I was very critical of Kavanaugh's nomination in the first place because he got up there in front of President Trump and the nation at a White House ceremony and said he regarded Justice Anthony Kennedy as somebody with a legacy of liberty. Liberty? Kennedy had upheld Roe v. Wade. Kennedy had authored the gay marriage decision. How is that a legacy of liberty? I said then, this guy cannot be trusted. He's not a true conservative, and it's a big mistake.
Okay, Michael, a couple questions for you. What was the name of what was the name of the Catholic bishop who helped Saul Alinsky start in Chicago in what year?
So the first cardinal that Alinsky and Egan approached was Cardinal Cody in Chicago, but Cardinal Cody is the one who actually broke up that relationship later on. He started to recognize a lot of the problems that were taking place, and he put the kibosh on that. But because the NCCB was formed in 1996, or I'm sorry, 1966, it was shortly, and the first president was Dearden. it was Egan and Bernardin who went to Dearden in 1969 to the NCCB and said, you should take up this national collection. We tested it out in Chicago. It worked out great. And it holds the record for the largest single day collection in the church, which was $8 million at that time.
Wow, one day.
Brenda is apparently doing some research on her own, and she's hitting some brick walls. She's wondering if you can give her any pointers on what's going on in West Virginia to be able to talk to the Catholic charities that are going on there. She said she found through a FOIA request made to the West Virginia State Department of Education that Catholic Charities of West Virginia are receiving millions every year for the school food programs and adult basic education as well. She guesses that that they're probably doing the same in most states.
That's entirely possible. When you're looking at the finances, you're not going to find a whole lot from the diocesan level, only because as a religious institution, there's no obligation on the part of the organization to report their taxes. So getting an audit or getting any kind of financial records is going to be very difficult. The FOIA request is a good place to start. You want to start looking into who's partnering with whom. Look for organizations that have partnered with the diocese, and then that way you can start to find a way to see where things are going or how things are being transacted. But getting financial records on a diocesan level is really, really hard.
Dear, I would also encourage her to, if she hasn't seen it, the lawsuit that was filed by her attorney general. It was, I think, basically a consumer fraud lawsuit against the Archdiocese or the Diocese of West Virginia. That may give her some ideas. It may also build contacts. Talk to the investigators in the attorney general's office. They've been very open and willing to take phone calls, questions, information. If she has some hunches or thinks that there may be some financial malfeasance going on, she should share that with the attorney general, because my experience is where there's sexual abuse, there's always financial misfeasance, always, because they need money to support their immoral activities and lifestyles. So there will always be stealing from the collection basket, some kind of fraud going on. I'd tell her to keep plugging away, keep digging, follow her gut, and ask for guidance from the Holy Spirit, and she's gonna hit pay dirt, I'm sure.
If I could add real quick in regards to the West Virginia situation, we have not gotten the full report about what was happening under the former Bishop Michael J. Bransfield, but we do have a letter that's you can find up on the web from William Lorry, who's taken over. He's now the apostolic administrator. He came down from Baltimore. He has a 3-page letter about what it's sort of a summary. We don't know all the details because, again, the full report has not been made public. But listen to this. This is from his letter about what Bransfield was up to in West Virginia. The investigation found that Bishop Bransfield initiated and completed extensive and expensive renovations to his private residences in both Wheeling and Charleston. Bishop Bransfield misused church funds for personal benefit on such things as personal travel, dining, liquor, gifts, and luxury items. I mean, these are the modern day money changers using church funds. This is not only illegal, as somebody said earlier, this is sinful. This is a disgrace.
Yeah. A couple of basic questions. Who does the Pope report to for his actions? And is there any way to remove Pope Francis?
Well,
that'd be a question for all three of you.
I think that's the question of the day. And I think there's all sorts of discussion, battles, arguments going on in the internet among intellectuals, among church officials, that there is no way to remove a pope. But Bishop Gracida, I would encourage people to follow retired Bishop Rene Gracida from Corpus Christi. He's been very vocal, expressing his disagreement, disgust with Pope Francis. He believes that there is a vehicle, a canonical vehicle, to get rid of the Pope, as best I can recall, bringing together a group of 12 cardinals to determine—
In perfect council.
Yeah, to determine the heretical statements, actions he has taken. You know, I think this battle, and it's becoming quite a battle, and is only going to get worse as we get, you know, closer to the Amazon Synod. I think, you know, we really have to pray that we have some brave, courageous cardinals and bishops that are, you know, they wear the red, the cardinals do, because it signifies that they will be martyrs for the faith, that they will die for the faith. We have yet to see any of them really stand up and be brave and courageous and fight for Holy Mother Church. There have been, of course, a few. Certainly Archbishop Vigano, who's been, you know, basically criticized and talked about by the Pope himself. So, it's a battle for, I think, canon lawyers to discuss, for theologians, and I don't know really what it's going to take for the cardinals to finally put their foot down. You know, it's interesting, the bishops and cardinals all take a loyalty oath to the Pope when they become a bishop or a cardinal. But it was, I think, Vigano as well as Burke who said, you know, I'm not being disloyal. No, who was it? Yeah, I think, it was Cardinal Zen. Cardinal Zen said, I'm not being disloyal to the Pope when I criticize his decision about China. This is a criticism, a disagreement, and I'm entitled to do that. So I think there's, in their head, or maybe in their heart, they don't feel that they're able to speak out. Michael, what do you think?
Well, the short answer is that the person that the Pope answers to is our Lord.
Yeah.
This has always been the case, and it was very evident in the Acts of the Apostles. I mean, you had Peter walking, you know, our Lord told him that he had the keys. Our Lord talked to him. Our Lord gave him the authority, but at the same time, he has an obligation. If you look at the legend of the church, where we have the Quo Vadis statement, you know, where are you going? I'm going back to Rome to be crucified a second time. Why? Because Peter was walking away from the cross. He was walking away from Rome. So that's when Peter turned around and went back, and that's when he was crucified. But so Peter has an obligation to our Lord. He has a duty. In fact, it was just on Friday where we heard the reading, Peter, do you love me? Mm-hmm. Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Tend my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. So he was told 3 times his duty is to the sheep. But when you have Peter who is turning his back on the sheep and he's walking away and he's leading them astray, well, it won't be long before our Lord steps in and takes action. So we have to pray, and we have to maintain our prayers not only for him but for the church, and we have to make our appeal to our Lord and say, look, this is beyond our ability to grasp, to wrestle with, and to fix. We humans cannot fix this. It has to be done through grace, but that grace comes through penance, and that penance comes through prayer. So this is the obligation that we have as faithful. I think it's wrong-headed for us to wonder, well, how can we get rid of this problem? It's not a problem to be solved. It's a suffering and a chastisement to be endured to some respect. And we have to realize, did did a group of men at St. Gallen's wrestle away authority from God's hand without him knowing it? Well, no, of course not. That authority, that change took place because God allowed it to happen, and he allowed it to happen because we are being chastised. It is a chastisement. We have to recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've got another question. You haven't mentioned the Catholic dollars. I'm going to comment and say I think we did a little bit, but Gail is asking, you haven't mentioned the Catholic dollars that has been part and parcel of the American education system being taken over by socialist agenda and crossover with unions. I think you talked a little bit about it, but you want to comment on that?
Who's that for?
Any one of you. Cliff, do you have any ideas on that? Any thoughts?
Well, this gets to an issue that bothers me immensely about so-called Catholic education. It's too secular. Plus, I know here in Maryland, they scramble to get state tax dollars. This is the one thing that the Catholic politicians in Maryland do for the Catholic Church. They get, I don't know, a couple $1 million for school books for the Catholic schools. And yet at the same time here in Maryland, like Massachusetts, the most Catholic states in the country, they favor and promote abortion on demand, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, blah, 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 blah. But then they vote a couple $1 million for some Catholic school books and say, well, I've done my duty. It's just so disgusting here in Maryland to watch these Catholic politicians, and I'm talking about the state legislature. We have a Republican governor, Larry Hogan, but he's a never-Trumper. He goes along with the Democrats, and I guess this gets back to a broader point. It's somewhat off the point about. I don't think the Catholic Church, the Catholic bishops in this case, should take one dime from the federal government. I don't think they should take one dime, 1 cent.
Can I just yell an amen right there with you?
I think it's wrong for them to take all these millions of dollars, supposedly, of course, for charitable or good purposes to resettle the refugees. You know, we know the rationale for it, but I think it's wrong for God's church on earth to take any state money. I mean, I thought there were Bible verses about this. You know, separation of church and state is not, of course, in our Constitution, and we know it's been distorted. But in a sense, I agree with the separation of church and state. I don't think the church ought to take any state money. And I'm so tired of the Catholic Church on so many levels scrambling for these dollars from either the state government, for some school books, or from the federal government. Keep the church away from the state.
Michael, another amen?
Oh, yeah. What can I say to that? I mean, absolutely. I'm finding that one of the biggest problems with all of these groups is that they take money from the federal government. And as the line goes, if you're going to take the king's shilling, you'll do the king's willing.
That's right.
And that's really kind of the case. We have to get out of the business of the federal dollars and the lobbying for federal dollars. And, you know, it's interesting. It's not just a matter of doing the willing of the government in order to follow the government's policies, but when the church starts turning what should be the act of charity, the literal act of caritas between two individuals, and turn it into an industry, that's not just, you know, a bad idea. It's evil and wicked, and it should not be done. It's disgusting.
Well, just to follow on with a little bit of that, I think Don is asking, is making some statements and question. USCCB had paid more than $2.1 billion with a B related to abuse settlements from 2004 to 2012. Mm-hmm. They are easily paying out at least $100 million a year in continuing settlement money, probably much more. How do we know that any of the money raised is not going to cover their costs from the pederast priest crisis?
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. And the reason we don't know is that the USCCB and the individual dioceses are not required to file any audited paperwork.
See, Tammy is asking, do you know that the Catholic Charities and Lutheran social services involved with refugee resettlement are forbidden by our government, who are funding them to proselytize the refugees?
Yes. Yes, I do know that. And I also know, which, you know, again, goes to Michael's point. You know, we're not, that's not charity work. That's not bringing the gospel to people. And what we also know, you know, I've talked to people who've been involved in this, but is that the vast majority of money doesn't go to the refugees. It goes to the administration, the salaries, the bureaucracies of the Catholic Church, Lutheran social services. So they literally drop them into a county, into a small town, get them their social aid, their money, their food stamps, etc., and goodbye, they're gone. So, and yes, and there's no discussion of the faith, and that's really, we've lost that whole sense of subsidiarity, of being able to, which is true social justice, is being available person to person at the lowest level possible, helping your neighbor, helping your family member. That's what the nuns taught us. And again, to Catholic education, because Vatican II, they all fled, all the priests fled, all the nuns fled. We didn't have the nuns to teach us the true faith. But back to that education question, this is precisely a place where Catholics can really make a difference by keeping the curriculum Catholic. In religious education, I'm now told that they have a huge climate change agenda in the religious education curriculum. This is where, when they start hearing from 5, 10, 15 moms and dads about, hey, I'm spending money for religious education, or I want a Catholic education, you can have an enormous impact on teachers, on principals, on the parish, in bringing the faith back to and being taught. So people underestimate, oh, nobody's going to listen to me, or it's just my voice. Don't underestimate yourself. And bring your friends into the battle. You'll be surprised how many people are also concerned about this.
All right. I think we probably only have time for about one more question. And let me see if I can find one of the, let's see. This is for Michael. If Catholic churches are suggesting that parishioners should vote Democrat, what can be done to inform parishioners that they should rethink this?
Well, not only if there is an explicit call to vote Democrat, you should be reporting this to your congressman, because it's illegal. It is that would be a huge violation of their tax-exempt status for them to tell them what party to vote for. Now, what they will do is talk about the issues, and they'll say, oh, we need to help the poor, and we need to be focused on the environment, we need to be focused on immigration, and you should look at your voter guides and see which candidate supports those positions. So they won't say anything explicitly about voting Democrat, but they'll talk about policies and push the ideology that's going to push people in the direction of voting for a Democratic candidate. If that's what's happening, I would encourage you to say, well, you know, the non-negotiables on the family, on the matters of life, on the matters of contraception, those are non-negotiables. And if you have a candidate who is pushing those ideologies and those agendas, then you can't vote for them. If they want to fund an organization like Planned Parenthood, who is dissecting babies and selling their parts, then that's unacceptable. You can't vote for that person. Would you turn it around on them? You can even say things like, well, let's put it this way. Would you vote for a candidate that was pushing for genocide in Rwanda? Well, no. Well, of course not. Well, why not? Well, because that's murder. Well, so is abortion. You know, so you have to turn the agenda back around on them. Would you vote for somebody who was racist? No. Well, if you wouldn't vote for somebody who's racist, why would you vote for somebody who's pro-homosexual? Because that's just as much opposed to the church's racism is. So you take the issue, you flip it around on them, and you point out how they're being inconsistent in saying, well, you know, we have to have a seamless garment. But if you have non-negotiables, well, you have to adhere to your own logic.
I would also say to get a pro-life voter guide, you know, your Right to Life organizations in nearly every community rate the various politicians based on their pro-life stances. And for all the people on the call, the public sidewalk in front of your church is public space, and you're entitled to stand there and hand out literature. And so, you know, if you are upset by the stance of your pastor, you're absolutely entitled to hand out literature outside on the public space, in the sidewalk in front of the parish.
Well, the last question is going to probably be directed to Dick to close us out. What do you want people to take away from this presentation? What are the action items you would like to give? Great question to close us out.
Well, it is. I think we're going to remind people that they are Catholics, of course, and they are Americans. And they need to think about all the issues that have been discussed tonight. They certainly need to know that they got to be registered to vote. That's our privilege. And they need to encourage all of their parishioner friends that they need to get ready. They need to prepare now for what's coming a year from now. That's called the primary season. We need to understand the election season. And it's just going to be irresponsible for people to pass up next summer's primary and the election. This election is so powerful. We know there are the highest level of disagreement. We talked about the Vatican and its leftist bent. We talked about the Vatican and its connection to Islam. One of the things we haven't mentioned, which is always interesting, we do have a Pope who embraces Islam. We have McCarrick, who apparently was part of that campaign. The whole notion of interfaith. I wonder how many Catholics are aware, on the other side of the table from McCarrick, and the person that the Pope embraced is a leader who says that Christ was not crucified, that Jesus Christ was not the Son of God. Mm-hmm. And that's a paraclete. The Holy Spirit has a name, and his name is Mohammed. That's what the man that the Pope embraced believes. That's what he teaches the mosques. That's what the Archbishop of Detroit embraces, the Imam in Dearborn. That's what we're talking about, this whole interfaith item. So this is a very, very serious issue. I think one of the takeaways for me this evening, by the way, would be the whole notion of money changers. Think about what happened to the money changers in the Bible. That's what we're really talking about. Somehow this has gotten off the rails. We have a major corporation. We have a major business entity functioning without even basic morality. Decisions are made not based on basic morality, which is the underpinning of the gospel and of what Jesus came to do. And yet we have a corporation that's running on unethical, immoral decision-making and moving lots of money around. So we want to thank our guests very, very much tonight. You've enlightened us. I am going to have a few closing administrative comments. Liz and Cliff and Michael, thank you so much. Any final comments before we say goodnight and we move over to the administrative? We want to take a few minutes to tell people what's coming up next. But Liz, what would be your closing?
My final thought is that individual Catholics have the power to impact the church, both through prayer, through action, through organizing. And it's important that the most important thing you read about, in my opinion, is about the church, what's going on in the church. And everybody can play a role, and your role is critically important, especially during this really crisis of the church, that the Lord wants you to be his instrument to clean up the church, to do your part, to pray on what God wants you to do, and to stay close to the sacraments, to stay close to his Blessed Mother. Despite all the discouraging talk we discussed tonight, is that it's really most important to remain steadfast to our Lord and to really rededicate yourself to your Catholic faith.
Dick, I would only add, in line with what Liz said, that individual Catholics should not give up the hope, should not be despondent. There are many good priests out there. You have to support them. I just participated in an event in Southern Maryland on behalf of a Jubilee celebration for a priest, a great priest who's been in the church for 50 years.
Wow.
And yeah, he's faced some obstacles and some challenges, but he's trying to do what he can within the church to reform it, to have his say. I think another thing individual Catholics can do rather than just close their wallet in general, and I do recommend that and endorse that, is contribute to those Catholic groups that you know are legitimate and are doing good work. For example, the Knights of Columbus has a great program to put sonograms in the sonogram machines in the pro-life pregnancy centers, so that once a pregnant woman gets into that center, they can actually show her the baby. I mean, the sonograms today are amazing in terms of what you can see. I remember when we had our first child, we've had 3 sons, sonogram machines way back then, that was 31 years ago, were very blurry. You could hardly make them out. You thought you saw a baby there, but you had to have a technician or an expert say, well, this is the head, these are the family jewels, you know, this kind of thing. But these days, the sonograms are so realistic. And if you saw that movie Unplanned, you know, that was the moment in that great movie where the director of the Planned Parenthood clinic who was participating in an abortion looked at the abortion on the sonogram machine, saw the little baby being dismembered and sucked out. And all of a sudden, oh my gosh, it's actually a human being. So the Knights of Columbus, my point is, there's individual Catholic groups out there doing great work. Contribute directly to them. Bypass your local church. Bypass the bishops. Bypass the Vatican. You can still make a difference that way.
I would only add that we have to remember that, you know, in this age, what we're enduring is a problem of social justice, where you have a group of people who are approaching the church as if there's some sort of collective bargaining with God, where we can all, you know, unionize and be saved together. And that's just not the case. At the end of the day, I'm going to be judged in accordance with my actions, in accordance with my thoughts, in accordance with my sins and merits. And so will Cliff, so will Liz, so will all of us. So if we are looking at the problems, we have to remember that I like the words of St. Paul. When he went to Athens, he tried all sorts of different arguments to convert the Athenians. He tried to use cleverness in order to get them to see the truths of the church. And he walked away. He was despondent, and he said, he turned around, and the second time he preached was, I come to preach Christ crucified. If we are going to see any change in the church, we have to remember that it is Christ crucified who is our message. That is what we have to be focused on. That was the moment when Peter was sinking into the water, was when he took his eyes off our Lord. We have to keep our eyes on our Lord, and we have to continue to remember that whatever is happening in the world, like on the road to Emmaus, you had the people who did not recognize Christ. Why? Because they were so focused on the news of the day. And things are difficult. Things are very hard right now, and we are all suffering. But if we focus that suffering and try and unite ourselves with Christ on the cross, and we hold on to our rosaries and we continue to pray not for ourselves only, but also for each other, and especially for the Pope and the Church, we're going to see a greater change than anything that we could do collectively.
Great, Mike.
Well, let's thank Michael for your work, and Cliff and Liz, thank you for pulling it all together. Mary, I want to give you a special thank you. I have never seen more questions. So let me say, the three of you have generated a lot of questions. Mary did a great job of going through them, and we really appreciate that. This is Sharia Crime Stoppers. We do continue, so I do have a couple of administrative things to connect to. Let's see. I believe we can do that right here, and we'll say goodnight in just a few minutes. Let's remember that, I think that'll work. So we always try to talk about an action item. We really talked to this one. We'll go over it briefly. Lots of other good action items. A couple of Sundays from now, 2 or 3 from now, the second collection is Peter Spence. We've actually are encouraging people to take action on that day, close the wallet. Think about all the other things you can do. We do have a petition. If you go online and you Google red-blooded American Catholics, you'll find the petition and you may choose to sign that. We've got other things coming up we want to talk about, and we have a little historical note. We created, well, I just want to say last Friday night was a big deal on our radio program, Sharia Crime Stoppers Action, and guess who was there? Liz Yore was part of last Friday night, and I'm only bringing that to your attention because we think it was exceptional. We thank Liz. But the other person who made it exceptional is a U.S. congressman from Pennsylvania. His name is, it looks like I copied the wrong sign again, Mary. I apologize. Congressman Scott Perry, P-E-R-R-Y. I did it again. Look online to the United West, Perry. I did it again. But United West has a podcast for June the 4th. Please listen to it. It's on female genital mutilation. It's a great Congressman Perry, and Liz was a big part of that. We're continuing on the radio in a couple of nights, 3 nights from now. Jim Simpson, another Maryland resident, will be with us on Friday the 14th, and he's going to be talking about the Red Green Axis, which is a new book that he's built with the Center for Security Policy. That will be this Friday night. If you want to know how to join the radio program, again, United West, the Sharia Crime Stoppers page, again, managed by Mary. I will show you how to connect to the program. Simply Google Global Patriot Radio. We have another webinar next week. The chairman of the board of the United West, Tom Trenchel, will be on, and he will be telling us all the things United West are doing to deal with uniting Western civilization to take dead aim on Islam, to support Israel, etc. We keep going with the enemies within the church. The evangelicals and the Jews will be back on the 25th. There's an organization called Proclaiming Justice to the Nations. Lori Cordoza Moore is the head of that, and Michael Goldstein is the legal counsel. They're going to talk to us about evangelicals that are supporting Jews in America and Israel, a very important topic. Again, this is the way to fight the enemies within the church. A couple more. We have a webinar coming on. We'll show a documentary and talk to Michael Waller from the Center for Security Policy on the 2nd of July. The topic is Qatar, country of Qatar, blood money. It's unbelievable to see the money that comes into Washington, D.C. and goes deep into the swamp from the country of Qatar. We had a very successful program on mosques. We're going to have another one on mosques on Tuesday, July the 9th. And this time we're going to bring in the author of the Muslim Mafia books. If you may know, his name is Dave Gabach. He's been undercover in over 300 mosques in America. And of course, David Boris is the co-founder of the Sharia Crime Stoppers. So these are things that we're grateful to all these great people, like the 3 people that you saw tonight. We're going to be continuing to do that. Who are we? We are Sharia Crime Stoppers. We're part of the United West. Again, it all happens because people are encouraged by what we do, and they demonstrate that through donations if it's at all possible. So thank you for a very, very busy night. We appreciate our listeners, and we want to thank Liz Yore, Cliff Kincaid, and Michael Hichborn, of course, and Mary as well. So with that, we'll say good night. Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody, and thank you all.
Good night.